good afternoon to each and every one of you. I've heard some of the keynotes and witnesses, and they left me so happy, especially because they focused on the main point, which is the love in the family. When you see the cover of the document, you see here at the bottom, it says on love and family, about love and family. And this is what you've been talking about at this forum, about love and the family. The great objective of the Pope is to strengthen love in the family. And I think that you've been reflecting very much on this. Now, we shall focus on chapter 8, which is not the most important, of course, but since it was so controversial, it is worthwhile to better understand what the Holy Father had in mind when he wrote this chapter. Very well, thank you. So let's project the video that you had sent us, and then we will have the chance to have a dialogue with you, Monsignor. In chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, Francis refers to those situations which do not yet correspond or no longer correspond to his teaching or marriage, the so-called irregular situation. For Francis, however, this is a secondary issue. What interests him most are the two central chapters dedicated to love. There he proposes a beautiful task to simulate the growth, consolidation, and deepening of love. That is his main intention in Amoris Laetitia, to take care of love of married couples. How? Well, to help them grow. That's why he says married love is not first of all cared for by speaking of indissolubility as an obligation or by repeating a doctrine, but by strengthening it through constant growth under the impulse of grace. In this general framework, what is the precise meaning of this chapter 8, which speaks of broken loves? He says, it is first of all an invitation to mercy and to pastoral discernment in the face of situations which do not fully respond to what the Lord proposes us. It does not say that everything is misery, but that they do not respond fully to God's plan. It would be impossible to deny that the question of possible access to communion for some divorced and remarried people is also being raised. The Pope tried to keep this step discreet at the bottom of the page. This is why some claim that nothing would change. That is only possible if the nullity of the previous bond has been declared or if they live as siblings. But finally, Francis closed the discussion and stated the correct interpretation. He did so by accepting the guidelines of the bishops of the Buenos Aires region. They speak of the possibility for divorced people in a new union to live in continence, but add that in other more complex circumstances, and when a declaration of nullity could not be obtained, the option mentioned, that is to live in continence, may not in fact be feasible. He says, If it is recognized that in a concrete case there are limitations that mitigate responsibility and culpability, particularly when a person considers that he or she would fall into further fault by harming the children of the new union, Amoris Laetitia opens up the possibility of access to the sacraments of reconciliation and Eucharist. Francis immediately sent them a formal letter saying that this is the meaning of chapter 8 and added, there are no other interpretations. Both the guidelines of the Pope's letter were published in the Acta Apostolic See together with a rescript declaring them authentic magisterium. Therefore, there is no longer any doubt. Of course, there were negative reactions. Let us remember that when Saint John Paul II proposed that the divorced and remarried should live together in full continence as a condition for access to Eucharistic communion, this was already an important novelty, and many did not accept it. With Benedict XVI, there was another novelty. While St. John Paul II called for a commitment to live in full continence, he proposed, more delicately, said to strive to live as friends. You know, it's more delicate to strive to live as friends. Francis acknowledges the possibility of proposing full continence to the divorced and remarried, but admits that there may be difficulties in practicing it. This is in note 329. But note 364 gives room for administering the sacrament of reconciliation to them even when new faults are foreseeable. For he argues that one should not demand of penitence an unshadowed purpose of amendment, whereby mercy vanishes beneath the pursuit of a supposedly pure justice. And there he takes up an important statement by St. John Paul II, who held that even the foreseeability of a new fault does not prejudge the authenticity of the purpose. The purpose may still be authentic. It is true that we need to avoid scandal, but that scandal only occurs if people flaunt their situation as if it were correct. Otherwise, scandal would also occur when the first marriage was declared null. Francis says, we need to avoid persecution or too harsh judgment. Now, let's devote attention to the fundamentals of this possibility that the Pope opens up to. There are two important foundations here. It is important to pay attention to two fundamentals presented in Amoris Laetitia. The formulation of general principles, when he says, the more one descends to the particular, the more indeterminacy increases. This is quoting Saint Thomas Aquinas. It is not that general moral laws cannot reach concrete situations. The norm is to be considered as universal, but this expression cannot cover all situations. It is true that It is the formulation of the norm that cannot be all-encompassing, not the norm itself. This applies even to the formulation of natural law. The absolute rule itself admits of no exceptions, but its brief formulation does not apply in every sense and without nuance to every situation. The do not kill leaves room for this question: should the taking of life in self-defense be included in the expression kill, prohibited by the norm? If a couple cannot fails to live perfect continence, should they always be called adulterers? And then the second fundamental, which is the teaching of the church on the conditionalities or mitigating factors. Why that? Because it is not possible to maintain that objectively evil acts are in all cases gravely dishonest in a subjective sense. These are evil doings. However, they are not always grave cases. Consider a woman who has been beaten and despised by her Catholic husband from the very first day of their marriage, and who has obtained refuge, financial and psychological help from another man who has helped her to bring up the children from their previous union. With this second union, they had new children, and they've been living together for several years. The question is not whether this woman does not know that cohabitation outside marriage does not correspond to what the church teaches, but it is not about, not knowing what is good and what is bad. The limits have to do with something more complex. First, whether a woman who knows of the existence of the norm can really understand that not abandoning his man, from whom she cannot demand total and permanent continence for the time being, is really a very serious fault against the will of God. Maybe that man is not even fully Catholic, but they have new children. So can she abandon him? Francis considers in 301 that even knowing the norm, a person may be in concrete conditions that do not allow him or her to act differently and make other decisions without new guilt. He refers to subjects who are not in a position either to understand, to appreciate, or to fully implement the objective requirements of the law. In another paragraph, 302, he reaffirms it. In certain circumstances, people find it very difficult to act differently. As you see, the emphasis here is placed on the conditions that can attenuate or nullify responsibility and culpability, even in the face of a negative precepts and absolute moral norms. Therefore, if it is a venial fault, the person still can enjoy the sanctifying grace. The Pope wanted to emphasize the distinction between objective sin and subjective guilt. Thus, even if it can be clearly maintained that the sexual relations of divorced persons in a new union are an objective situation of habitual grave sin, this does not imply that there is necessarily grave sin in the subjective sense, that is, grave guilt which deprives one of the life of sanctifying grace. As Amoris Laetitia says in 301, the Church has a solid reflection on the conditions and extenuating circumstances. Therefore, it is no longer possible to say that all those who find themselves in some so-called irregular situation live in a situation of mortal sin, deprived of sanctifying grace. Now, this is what the Church teaches in his catechism in 1735. The Church has assumed, even in the catechism, that the imputability and responsibility for an action can be diminished or even suppressed because of ignorance, inadvertence, violence, fear, habits, disordered affections, and other psychological or social factors. So it is not about not knowing whether something is good or bad. It is about knowing if they can or can't do something. Saint John Paul II, in FC Familiaris Consortio 84, that in certain cases, men and women, for serious reasons, such as, for example, the education of children, are unable to fulfill the obligation of separation. Note that he says cannot. Benedict XVI was even more forceful in saying that in some cases, objective conditions are present which make cohabitation irreversible de facto. So, cohabitation, yes. Sexual relationships, no. This becomes more complex, for example, when the man is not a practicing Catholic. The woman is not in a position to force someone who does not share all her convictions to live in perfect continence. In that case, it is not easy for an honest and pious woman to make the decision to leave the man she loves, who protected her from a violent husband and who saved her from falling into prostitution or suicide, especially if there are new children. Are they falling into a new sin? So here, the ability to decide of this woman, where is it? She's conditioned. Francis says, consider especially those families who live in situations of poverty. Let's avoid imposing a set of rules on them as if they were a rock, which has the effect of making them feel judged and abandoned. So this does not mean that what is objectively wrong becomes objectively right. Francis speaks of an objective situation of sin. God's plan is marriage understood as an indissoluble union, and this point was not in doubt. Since the degree of responsibility is not the same in all cases, the consequences or effects of a rule need not necessarily always be the same. This we read in number 300. And in 336, it says, nor with regard to the sacramental discipline, since discernment may recognize that in a particular situation, there is no grave fault.
Tenemos todavía una segunda parte del video.
There's still a second part to this video. Just a second.
Hemos visto la cuestión doctrinal fundamental.
So let's move now to a more spiritual and pastoral issues that have to do with this topic. The question arises, what the Pope says, can this be discerned in pastoral dialogue? That is, in a conversation between the layperson and the priest. The Pope says, yes, it is possible. And this opens the way for a change in discipline, a fundamental change. What we've said so far is already part of the reflection of the Church, or one way or another, but the great novelty lies in this point, a discernment. There is a discernment between a person and her or his spiritual direction. And the pastoral discernment in the internal sphere can have practical consequences for the way discipline is applied. The awareness of the individual person of their real situation before God, of their real possibilities and limits, plays a central role here. And this conscience, accompanied by a pastor and enlightened by the guidelines of the Church, is capable of an assessment and a judgment sufficient to discern the possibility of access to communion. Now, the following question is, does this imply that a judgment can be made about one's own state of grace? And this is a fundamental question. And John Paul II affirmed this in Ecclesia Eucharistia when he said that judgment on the state of grace obviously belongs only to the person concerned, since it is an assessment of conscience. But it must be made clear that it is only a matter of a certain moral certainty. It is never a certainty, even if one is not aware of serious faults. There's never certainty. The Council of Trent defined that looking at ourselves, we cannot be certain about our state of grace. In order to receive communion, a minimum of moral certainty is sufficient, which a person can attain after a process of personal and pastoral discernment. And this discernment should not be based only on a single general norm, but the reality of that person. And so, is this change possible? Could Pope Francis open a door that was closed? Well, the answer is yes, because an evolution in the Church's doctrine and the Church's understanding of its own doctrine and its disciplinary consequences is possible. Let us look at some historical examples. Let us recall the case of slavery. Pope Nicholas V allowed the King of Portugal to take slaves. Then the Bull Romanus Pontifex of 1455 reaffirmed it. It was possible to have slaves. And this is not a secondary issue, since it has to do with the inalienable dignity of the human person. The same was true of religious freedom or the possibility of salvation outside the Catholic Church. As a result of changes in the understanding of doctrine, there were, as a consequence, various changes in the discipline. So there was a huge evolution in this sense. Think about divorced people and new unions. The fact is that even in disciplinary praxis concerning their divorce and remarried, there have already been important changes in the last century. Now, let's clarify some very important points. First, Amoris Laetitia rejects the attitude of someone who flaunts an objective sin as if it were part of the Christian ideal. So that cannot be the fruit of a personal choice of an ideal of life. And then the Pope also excludes the case of a new union coming from a recent divorce, or the situation of someone who has repeatedly failed in his or her family commitments. At the same time, it has to analyze how they have behaved towards their children. And in number 300, Pope Francis suggests what I've just said, to analyze how they have behaved towards their children or towards the abandoned spouse. The discernment that Francis suggests has limits. In 298, he says, on the other hand, he calls for special attention to be paid to people who are aware of the seriousness of their situation, but who have a great difficulty in turning back without feeling in conscience that they are falling into new guilt. Francis proposes that in a context of attenuated guilt, we should seek to respond to God's will with greater dedication. One can opt for a greater commitment to the children with a greater generosity. They can choose to have a more intense dialogue, a more generous service. There are many things that can be chosen and that can help that family group to grow. It is about asking ourselves, what is the generous answer that can be offered to God, what God is calling for in the midst of the concrete complexity of the limits. This is true not only for divorced persons in a new union, but for all so-called irregular situations. But this path of discernment, where there is room for serious and prudent accompaniment, will not necessarily lead to the sacraments. It should always open up the possibility of a greater integration into the church, so that not only do they know that they belong to the body of Christ, which is the church, but that they can have a happy and fruitful experience. At the same time, it challenges pastoral care not to fall into moral mathematics without propositionally taking charge of the reality that goes beyond any idea. It is about realizing the ideal to be, it is about the ideal to be realized more fully. As you can see, Francis' proposal is very challenging and demanding. It would be easier or more comfortable to pretend that everything is just black and white. But such comfortable rigidity can be a betrayal of the heart of the gospel. When Francis says we attach so many conditions to mercy that we empty it of concrete meaning and real significance. And that is the worst way of watering down the gospel. It is better to take up the path of accompanying, discerning, and integrating, a task that is not only the priest's responsibility, but that of the whole community.